For far too long, Vladimir Putin has been convinced that Russia will win the Ukraine war. It was meant to happen quickly, but it didn't. Russia was supposed to attrit Ukraine, but hasn't. Now a win in Putin's eyes would be convincing Ukraine to cede territory in Donbas to Russia. It's not all that Putin wanted, and if Finland has anything to say about it, Russia's president won't even be getting that. Finland has delivered a double slap to Putin with a sharp message that lets the Russian leader know that his authority will never be officially recognized. The Kremlin has been shaken to its core, but Putin may still have a lifeline in US President Donald Trump. On October 18th, BBC reported on several comments made by Finnish President Alexander Stubb, who was interviewed on BBC Radio 4's Today broadcast. Stubb said in no unclear terms that there will be no time in the future when Finland recognizes Crimea as part of Russia. The peninsula, which Putin annexed in 2014, has been occupied by Russia for over a decade. That doesn't matter to Stubb. Ever since the Crimean annexation, Finland has been relying less and less on Russia as a trade partner, says the Centre for European Reform, or CER. It shares an interesting chart showing that about 18% of Finland's imports came from Russia in 2012. By 2015, which is a year after the annexation of Crimea, those imports were down to about 11%. And though they rose as high as 14% in the years that followed, the imports dropped to a low point of 8% in 2022, which is when Putin invaded Ukraine. Finland has been showing Russia that it means business with these trade decreases for over a decade. Now, Stubb has put into words what Finland's actions have demonstrated. But it's not just Crimea that was on Stubb's mind on October 17th. In addition to discussing how Finland would never recognize the Russian occupation of that peninsula, Stubb added that the same goes for any region that Russia tries to claim as a result of the Ukraine invasion. Stubb made particular mention of the Luhansk and Donetsk regions in Donbas. Russia currently occupies around 70% of the latter and almost all of the former, the BBC reports. But invasion does not equal ownership, according to Finland's president. The only ones who can decide on the land issue are the Ukrainians themselves, Stubb said in a pointed message directed at Putin. This is not Russia's land to take, Stubb is saying, and it doesn't matter how much Putin wants to pretend that it is. Russia's leader is desperate to get his hands on as much of the Donbas as possible. Al Jazeera explained a few of the reasons why in an August 19th article, noting that the Donbas offers strategic, economic, and symbolic benefits to the Kremlin. On the economic side, the outlet quotes the Center for Strategic and International Studies' Mark F. Kantsian, who says, "The Donbas was highly industrialized in the mid-20th century, though it became something of a rust belt after the Cold War." Kantsian adds that the region's farmland is some of the best in the world. So Putin may be looking at reinventing the industrialized Donbas of the Soviet era, while taking advantage of the region being a breadbasket for much of Europe. However, there is another economic factor at play here: minerals. Donbas has reserves of a lot of precious metals and minerals that Putin would love to profit from. Right now, Al Jazeera reports, Russia is already sitting on about 40% of Ukraine's metal resources. Donetsk is also home to the Shevchenko field of lithium ores, which is located in a rural settlement and is one of Ukraine's largest lithium deposits. The Economic Times adds that Donbas contains about 56% of Ukraine's hard coal reserves, which the outlet claims are worth about $12 trillion. That adds to the $12.5 trillion of mineral and gas assets upon which the Russian occupiers now sit in Ukraine. There's a lot of money to be made in Donbas, and Putin sees this figurative gold mine as a great way to right Russia's economic ship after the Ukraine war is over. On the strategic side, Al Jazeera says the port in Mariupol, which Russia also occupies, offers year-round access to the Black Sea. That access, when combined with the passage into the Black Sea that annexed Crimea already offers, would allow Russia to essentially control the Black Sea, should it be able to position more of its navy there. But perhaps more important than all of this, Al Jazeera says, it's the symbolic aspect of Donbas that most appeals to Putin. The region is home to many native Russian speakers. In Donetsk alone, almost 75% of the people use Russian in their homes, with the figure in Luhansk being 68.8%. That's a result of many Russians moving to the Donbas during the Soviet era, and it's this that Putin uses as so-called evidence that the region should belong to Russia. Eric Heron, who is a political scientist with West Virginia University, tells Al Jazeera, Russia has made many unsubstantiated claims about the treatment of Russian speakers there by the Ukrainian government. Donbas is symbolically central to Russia's story about why the war is happening. That symbolism is a strong influencing factor. If Ukraine were to cede Donbas to Russia, Putin will be able to parade around acting as though his justifications for the Ukraine invasion were legitimate. As for Ukraine, it will be left with Russia being far closer and having a much longer border with Ukraine than ever before. In other words, Putin might be happy to settle for Donbas today, but once Russia has built up a strong enough presence in the region, the rest of Ukraine will be back in Putin's crosshairs. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has repeatedly stated that he won't hand Donbas over to Russia in exchange for peace. Now, Stubb has thrown his hat into the ring. With just a few words, Finland's president has told Putin that any annexation of the Donbas that isn't entirely Ukraine's decision will be met with the Finnish cry of illegitimacy. It will never be accepted, and that means Putin won't be able to use his control over the region to ingratiate himself with Finland, or as seems likely, the rest of Western Europe. That was Stubb's first slap to Putin's face. As Russia's leader attempted to right himself, figuratively rubbing a Finnish handprint in an attempt to soothe the sting, Stubb delivered a second slap to the other cheek. Ukraine must join the European Union or EU, and ideally, NATO. I want to make sure that Ukraine, when this war is over, retains its independence, retains its sovereignty. In other words, becomes an EU member state and hopefully a NATO member, and also maintains its territorial integrity. Euromaidan Press reports Stubb as saying, "That is what we're all fighting for right now." Ukraine joining the EU may not have much of an impact on Putin, at least if the man himself is to be believed. In September, Russia's leader tried to claim that he never had any issue with Ukraine joining the EU, according to DW. The outlet points out that Russia has never officially opposed Ukraine's desire to join the EU. Putin said the same thing during a September visit to China, stating, "As for Ukraine's membership of the EU, we have never objected to this," before adding, "As for NATO, this is another issue." In other words, Russia seems to be saying fine to EU membership, but no to NATO. Stubb wants both for Ukraine, and Putin's comments about EU membership could also be disingenuous. Though it's true that Russia has never officially opposed Ukraine's attempts to join the EU, and that it would not be able to as a non-member, it's also important to remember the goal of Russia's supposed special military operation. There's a reason why the early days of the invasion saw Russia trying to penetrate Kyiv. Putin believes that Ukraine shouldn't exist as a sovereign nation. Perhaps Putin never lodged any official complaint about Ukraine's desired EU membership because he thought the country would be under Russia's control before any of that mattered. Ukraine isn't under Russian control. Now Putin seems to be trying to use EU membership as a way to get what he wants out of Ukraine right now: Donbas. Returning to Stubb's comments, there are now two questions to ask. Will Ukraine be able to join the EU, and will it eventually join NATO? The EU question is the far easier of the two to answer, as Ukraine has applied and is currently in negotiations with the EU for its membership. Accession negotiations were greenlit by the EU in December 2023, and the EU officially opened those negotiations about 6 months later. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen was also quick to point out that the EU would be more than happy to welcome Ukraine into the fold. "Europe is in the eyes of all Ukrainians who fight for a better future, and together we can win this fight. Together we can complete our union. Together we can bring Ukraine in our common European home. This is the dream of Ukraine's heroes and Ukraine's martyrs, and it's our dream too. Together we are Europe," von der Leyen has said of Ukraine's desired EU membership. In February, von der Leyen added that Ukraine is on track to join the EU before the decade is through. "I really appreciate the political will that is there. I would even say Ukraine's merit-based process, if they continue at that speed and at that quality, perhaps they could be earlier than 2030, the European Commission President claimed. Hold on a second. 2030? That's a long way for Ukraine's EU membership, which could raise some questions as to whether the EU is actually serious about welcoming Ukraine into the bloc. Those questions are dispelled when you realize that the EU is a very bureaucratic organization, and the 6 years from when Ukraine applied to the end of 2029 is actually pretty fast-tracked when it comes to EU membership. As the Pew Research Center notes, the average time from EU application to official membership is about 9 years, so Ukraine will be 3 years ahead of the curve. Ukraine's EU membership, though not exactly a given, seems very likely. The country's prospective NATO membership, which Stubb says he and Finland support, is far less certain. Putin has objected to this possibility many times in the past, and he's not the only one. On August 18th, ahead of a meeting with Zelensky at the White House, Trump said that Ukraine's president could end the Ukraine war if he wants to. However, there would be no going into NATO by Ukraine, included as part of any peace deal. This seems to be Trump communicating to everybody that Putin has made it clear that Ukraine's NATO membership is a deal breaker for Russia. Trump saying these things is a major problem for Ukraine. After all, the US is rightfully the major power player in NATO thanks to its enormous military budget, its ties to the rest of NATO members, and the 5,225 nuclear weapons that the Arms Control Association claims the US has in its stockpiles. Writing for the Cato Institute in March, Doug Bandow highlighted that Ukraine has received a no from successive US presidents. Trump's latest refusal might be the most recent, but both Joe Biden and Barack Obama have refused to consider Ukraine entering NATO. Interestingly, Bandow notes that former President George W. Bush was a proponent of Ukraine's NATO membership, though he adds that Bush's support may have been the problem that triggered everything we've seen in Ukraine over the past 2 decades. The transatlantic alliance's resulting promise to include Kyiv, made at Bush's behest at the 2008 Bucharest NATO summit, was an essential factor in Moscow's decision for war nearly 14 years later, Bandow writes. It's clear why Ukraine wants NATO membership. It hopes that this membership will deter Putin from any further aggression. If such membership were achieved as the Ukraine war rages, it would also mean that Putin faces a problem. Continuing to attack Ukraine in that scenario would trigger Article 5 of the NATO Charter, which would mean starting a war with all 32 NATO members along with Ukraine. That explains the US refusal. It doesn't want to be dragged into a direct fight with Russia, no matter how much it may seem to make sense to make Ukraine a NATO member on the grounds of its military strength and proximity to Russia. As for after the Ukraine war, that's where the complications lie. Even if we assume that Ukraine manages to defend its sovereignty and pushes Russia out of its territory, Bandow's point still stands. If Ukraine were to be granted NATO membership in the aftermath of the war, and this applies even for a version of Ukraine that has ceded Donbas, Putin would be furious. Would he be angry enough to start another Ukraine war, knowing what that would mean in the context of a Russian battle with NATO? Nobody really knows. And that's where the problem lies. But for Stubb, whose country has only joined NATO in the years since Putin invaded Ukraine, the answer to NATO's NATO question is cut and dry. By stating that Ukraine will hopefully join NATO, Stubb delivers his second Finnish slap to Putin's face. He's letting Russia know that Finland, at least, would support Ukraine joining the collective defense organization, perhaps because Stubb believes that Finland might be next. That's certainly an opinion shared by many of Stubb's country people. The Australian Broadcasting Corporation noted on October 18th, Finnish people point to their country's geography and history with Russia as the reason why they think Putin will turn his attention to them next. The latter issue in particular sees Finland share some interesting parallels with Ukraine, not least of which is the country ceding 10% of its territory to Russia as part of a peace treaty signed in the aftermath of the Winter War that Russia started against Finland in 1939. Finland knows what it feels like to lose territory to Russia. Stubb's comments suggest that his country has no intention of allowing Ukraine to feel that kind of pain, and Finland will support EU and NATO membership for Ukraine to ensure the nation's sovereignty. The double slap is complete, and the Kremlin is suitably shaken by this unsubtle showcase of Finnish support. However, there's a caveat to all of this. As good as it is for Ukraine to see that Finland backs it on everything from sovereignty to its membership in the 2 organizations that could ensure Putin never pulls anything like the Ukraine invasion again, Finland is a fairly quiet voice in the grand scheme of things. Stubb highlights that himself as he notes that Trump is the only Western leader who truly yields the power to bring Putin to the negotiating table. In his Radio 4 interview, Stubb said that he had told Trump that Putin couldn't be trusted during one of the golf games the pair of leaders have shared. Stubb adds, "What we need is not so much the power of the carrot to convince Russia to the negotiating table, it's more of the stick that will bring them," Stubb said during his interview. So you have to force Russia to come to the negotiating table for peace, and that's the deal that President Trump is trying to make. In other words, Trump can't tempt Putin into peace by acquiescing to him. Instead, it's pressure that will pay when it comes to the Ukraine war, and Trump is the only man capable of wielding the sort of pressure needed to make Putin back down. That leads us to the obvious question, will Trump help to create that pressure? It's possible. At the time of creating this video, Trump and Putin are set to meet in Hungary for what should be a discussion on peace. Interesting questions have been raised over this, including whether it's even safe for Putin to fly over the territory of the several European nations his plane has to bypass in order for him to even reach Hungary. At least Hungary is in the process of withdrawing from the International Criminal Court, or ICC. Hungary notified the United Nations about its withdrawal from the ICC in June, meaning it's under no obligation to follow through on the arrest warrant the ICC issued for Putin back in March 2023. So Putin will be safe in that respect. However, this conversation with Trump could go several ways. We already know that Trump, like Putin, says no to Ukraine's NATO membership. However, some believe that Putin is now ready to make a deal. One of those people is exiled Russian oligarch Mikhail Khodorkovsky. "I have the impression that Putin has sent Trump a signal that he's ready for a deal," Khodorkovsky said of the surprise Hungary meeting. However, he adds that he now has doubts about whether he understands what Putin wants anymore and that he has never had any idea about Trump's real goals in peace discussions. Trump may have offered a signal of what could end up being the outcome of the Hungary talks on October 19th. That's when The Independent reported on comments that Trump made to a Fox News anchor that suggest he expects Ukraine to make some form of territorial concession to bring about peace. "Well, he's going to take something," Trump said of Putin. "I mean, they fought, and he has a lot of property. I mean, he's won certain property." That comment casts a huge shadow over Stubb's slap to Putin. Finland's desire to protect Ukraine's sovereignty may not matter as much as Trump believing that the war in Ukraine could end if Ukraine cedes some territory. Donbas would be Putin's goal if Trump indicates a willingness to push Ukraine to cede, which would only lead to all of the issues we discussed earlier in the video. This isn't the stick that Stubb spoke of. It would instead be a big juicy carrot that Trump dangles in front of Putin's face. For his part, Zelensky says that the US, along with the rest of the West, should be increasing the pressure on Putin to force Russia's leader to crack. Also on October 19th, Ukraine's president urged Trump to get tougher on Putin and even indicated that he will be willing to join the Hungary summit to talk about peace directly with Putin. Zelensky likened the Ukraine situation to the one between Israel and Gaza, as he called Putin a terrorist. Putin is something similar but more strong than Hamas, Zelensky said, before noting that Russia has the world's second biggest army and that the Ukraine war is larger than the Israel-Hamas conflict. And that's why more pressure is needed to get Putin to stop, Zelensky adds. Just as Stubb says, the stick is going to be better for dealing with Putin than the carrot. Which of those two will Trump choose? We'll find out following the Hungary meeting. Russia's big summer offensive was supposed to be a major moment in the war, a moment when everything changed and the Kremlin's forces finally pushed on, breaking through Ukrainian defenses all along the front lines and capturing those all-important towns and cities needed to gain a vital advantage. Instead, the offensive, like others before it, fell flat, and now the situation is getting even worse for Russia. Vladimir Putin's entire front line is collapsing, and the latest statistics show just how costly this war has been for the Kremlin, with Russia losing approximately 5 times as many troops as Ukraine in total. It wasn't supposed to work out this way. On paper, Russia was supposed to dominate Ukraine from day one. It had the much larger force, the far bigger defense budget, a vast stock of tanks, armored vehicles, and other military equipment, and it was one of the most feared military superpowers on the planet. In contrast, Ukraine had a significantly smaller army to call on and certainly wasn't regarded as a great military nation on the world stage. With all of its military muscle and countless advantages, Russia could and perhaps should have swept Ukraine's resistance aside and pushed on to the kind of grand and glorious victory its leader no doubt envisioned back in early 2022 when he gave the initial order to invade. Instead, Russia has suffered setback after setback and loss after loss. Its gains have been minimal, its progress slow, and its losses beyond belief. Even this summer, when the Kremlin amassed a gigantic force and threw absolutely everything it had at Ukraine, boldly proclaiming that this would be one last push forward for victory, it once again failed. As we approach the end of October, the much-talked-about summer offensive is effectively over, and the results are nothing short of disastrous from the Kremlin's perspective. Despite this, some media reports have highlighted the fact that Russia did at least make some gains here and there during this period. Others have pointed out that Ukraine is currently struggling with a manpower shortage, while drawing attention to the fact that Russia is still somehow finding ways to recruit tens of thousands of new troops each month. This, on the face of it, suggests that the offensive wasn't such a failure after all, and that Russia may even be in the ascendancy, on track for more valuable gains by the end of the year. However, when we start to look a little deeper, the facts and statistics that have emerged in the wake of the summer offensive tell a very different story, and it's one that the Kremlin definitely won't be happy to hear. Reporters at The Economist recently took a deep dive look at statistics, open-source intelligence, charts, graphs, and casualty reports, coming to a very clear and definitive conclusion about Russia's current situation and future prospects. Russia's summer offensive is winding down. Many in the West focus on the grinding progress its troops have made and the shortage of Ukrainian manpower it's exposed, but that is to look down the telescope from the wrong end. More striking is how little territory Russia has taken in its third and largest offensive, and the terrible cost it has paid in men and materiel. Unless something dramatic changes, Vladimir Putin will be unable to win the war on the battlefield. The fact that he nevertheless continues to try regardless suggests that he's out of ideas. It's a damning statement, without a doubt, but it's also one that is backed up by reams of irrefutable evidence. Because even though it's impossible to measure with total precision exactly how much ground both sides control, we do have plenty of data to guide us in making reasonable estimates. There are open-source satellite images, for example, and live maps of the conflict that update over time as both sides announce various captures and losses. From that data, The Economist's reporters discovered that Russia has not, by any stretch of the imagination, gained a large amount of ground. In fact, if we examine territorial control charts dating all the way back to the start of the war, Russia controls less ground today than it did at various stages of 2022. The Kremlin even managed to capture over 25% of Ukrainian territory in the early stages of the war, as its forces surged onward, catching Ukraine somewhat off guard and sending in tanks and other heavy armor in vast quantities to overwhelm its opposition. However, once Ukraine began to find its feet in the war and launched its first big counteroffensive, the battle lines stabilized. Russia's total amount of control slipped down to around 20%, and it's more or less remained at that figure ever since. This demonstrates how the war is well and truly in a state of stalemate. Time and time again, we see Russian forces push on a little and perhaps capture a few square miles of farmland or the odd abandoned village here and there, laying claim to their valueless fields and crater-riddled streets with the wrecked remains of homes and buildings either side. Then, not long after, Ukraine often finds a way to recapture those locations and push the Russians back, and the cycle continues again and again, with both sides doing little more than exchanging the same scraps of land. As the Economist report notes, as far as large, significant cities are concerned, Russia hasn't managed to capture a single one since October 2022. It's certainly done its best, committing a colossal force of over 100,000 troops in a desperate attempt to capture the last Donetsk city of Pokrovsk, for example, as well as launching major assaults towards other towns, cities, and strategic locations. But it's all been for naught. Ukraine's defenders remain in firm control of the locations that matter most, like the famous fortress belt of Donetsk, made up of several interconnected cities that provide the Ukrainian armed forces with a firm defensive foothold and strong logistical links throughout the region, including Slovyansk, Kramatorsk, and Druzhkivka. Capturing even a single one of those cities has proven to be an impossible challenge for Putin's armies so far, despite their seemingly huge advantages in regards to tanks, manpower, and other military equipment. And if they can't even capture one proper city in 3 years, then any expectations of the Kremlin winning this war anytime soon are clearly nonsensical. Indeed, as the Economist report notes, if the war and Russia's progress continued as it has for the last month, it would take until 2030 just for Russia to capture the 4 regions that Putin initially spoke about when launching his so-called special military operation, namely Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia. What's more, if Russia wanted to occupy all of Ukraine, as it apparently does with Vladimir Putin recently going on record stating that all of Ukraine belongs to Russia, then it would take around 103 years, according to The Economist's best estimation. Maybe that's part of the reason why Putin was recently overheard chatting with Chinese leader Xi Jinping about organ transplants and immortality, at one point stating, "It's predicted that in this century it might become possible to live to 150. Well, Putin is now 73, and even if he found some sort of elixir of youth and made it to 150, that still wouldn't be enough time to see his country conquer all of Ukraine. In short, his dream of conquest will remain exactly that, a dream. The prospect of Russia taking over all of Ukraine is something he will never see, and it's even becoming unlikely he'll see his country capture the 4 original regions in their entirety, since Russia's progress in those areas is still so slow and coming at an extortionate cost, which leads us neatly onto the most shocking point from The Economist's extraordinary report. Compiling data from numerous sources and using over 200 credible estimates of casualties, the reporters were able to make a highly accurate, reliable, and data-backed assessment of how many Russian lives have been lost and how many soldiers have been forced from the front lines with injuries since the war began. What they found was, quite simply, jaw-dropping. Our meta-estimates suggest that from the beginning of the full-scale invasion to January of this year, Russian casualties amounted to 640,000 to 877,000 soldiers, of whom 137,000 to 228,000 have died. By October 13th, those totals have risen by almost 60% to 984,000 to 1,438,000 casualties, including 190,000 to 480,000 dead. So even in the absolute best-case scenario, if we look at the lower end of the estimated range, Russia has still lost about 1 million troops, with close to 200,000 of them killed. This ties in with what a lot of other sources have spoken about, with many, including the British Ministry of Defence, estimating that Russia passed the 1 million casualties milestone during the summer months. If, however, we explore the higher end of the estimated range, Russian casualty numbers may be significantly worse than expected, with possibly over 1.4 million casualties in total and close to 500,000 people dead. Either way, this is by far the worst war for Russia since World War II, by some distance. And when we look at the paltry amount of ground gained in exchange for those horrendous losses, it's also easily one of the most wasteful wars of all time, anywhere in the world. Countless lives have been lost, with families forced to mourn the deaths of brothers, husbands, fathers, and sons, all for almost no tangible gain in terms of territory and battlefield dominance. Russia is not capturing the towns and cities it needs to push on. It's not marching to victory. It is instead simply throwing soldiers into the meat grinder with reckless abandon, treating its people as little more than cattle, confident that it can always simply call up more to replace those it lost the previous week or month. For now, there is some truth to that statement, as Russia is still hitting and even exceeding its recruitment targets on a regular basis. This was confirmed in a recent report from Ukraine's main Directorate of Intelligence, GUR, which noted that the Kremlin has called up approximately 280,000 new personnel since the start of the year and is on track to hit its end-of-year goal of 343,000 new recruits. Again, however, this doesn't quite tell the full story. It's only when we dig deeper that we see how reckless and desperate Russia's recruitment strategy really is. For example, in order to keep bringing in the necessary numbers to counteract its losses, the Kremlin has resorted to enlisting hundreds of thousands of convicts, including rapists and killers, who could eventually be released on the streets of Russia if they survive long enough to serve out their contracts and head back home. Russian recruiters have also turned to hospitals, signing up individuals with chronic medical conditions like HIV and hepatitis. People in such ill health are unlikely to make much of an impact in frantic frontline firefights. Even the many healthy and able-bodied new recruits in the Russian ranks are only there for one reason: money. The Kremlin has made no secret of the fact that it offers huge cash incentives for those who volunteer to fight in Ukraine, with many men, often from low-income areas, simply deciding to play their part in the war as a way to support their families. This can't last forever, especially at a time when the Russian economy is in such a perilous position. Losing massive amounts of money daily and contending with a crippling fuel crisis, the Kremlin cannot hope to recruit willing and able soldiers indefinitely. It's also particularly damning to see that, just as the Economist report notes, Russia's casualty numbers have surged by around 60% between January and October of this year. That makes 2025 one of the bloodiest years on record for the Russian Federation, and it shows just how catastrophically the Kremlin has managed this war and harnessed the resources at its disposal. Still, it stubbornly persists with the same doomed tactics, throwing men into the fire and hoping somehow that the tide will turn in its favor in the end. But as The Economist notes, that is highly unlikely. Moreover, a sudden collapse in Ukraine's defensive lines is unlikely given how the two armies are fighting the war. Constant drone surveillance coupled with long-range precision weaponry has made massing forces near the front suicidal. Incremental gains remain possible, though only at enormous cost, by sending small groups of men into the kill zone to stake out forward positions. It's hard to breach Ukrainian lines. Should a breach happen, the advance of massed forces and equipment needed to exploit it is extremely difficult. In other words, the aforementioned stalemate situation is almost guaranteed to continue, and that means Russia is guaranteed to keep on losing more and more soldiers for almost no notable gains in an ever-worsening example of wastefulness and futility. The Economist then dropped an even bigger bombshell. Again, it used whatever reliable sources it could find to work out a reliable and realistic estimate of the number of Ukrainian soldiers that have been killed during the war so far. It found that Ukraine has lost at least 77,403 soldiers since the full-scale invasion began, with another 77,842 missing in action. Looking at the figures for this year, it appears that Ukraine has lost a minimum of 8,668 people, though The Economist notes that this is the lower bound, and the true figure could be notably higher. However, even if the real amount of Ukrainian soldier deaths in 2025 is twice as high as the lower bound estimate, it's still dramatically lower than the estimated number of Russian fatalities in the same period. In fact, as The Economist notes, the figures show that for this year, roughly 5 Russian soldiers have lost their lives for every 1 Ukrainian death. So even though many news headlines and reports have focused on Russia's rampant recruitment and Ukraine's manpower crisis, the figure tells a markedly different story. If these casualty rates continue or don't improve massively from a Russian perspective, then manpower is likely to become a much bigger issue for Moscow than it is for Kyiv. Because, as stated, Russia cannot keep this up forever. Back when the war began, it didn't have such a hard time recruiting new troops. It offered generous sign-on bonuses, and there were plenty of people who believed in the lies of the special military operation, expecting that they'd make some easy money and be back home toasting to victory with their loved ones in a matter of months or even weeks. But the longer the war has continued, the more people have seen it for what it really is. Now, Russia has to call up people who have already shown reluctance to fight, since they've spent more than 3 years on the sidelines, and every new recruit is more aware of what they're getting into, with many likely knowing that they may never go home and see their families again. As a result, Russia may find its numbers of willing applicants start to diminish in the months ahead, and the Kremlin may then have to offer even more lucrative contracts and larger sign-up bonuses, or resort to more desperate measures to bolster its ranks. Russia also can't rely on wounded troops making full recoveries and heading back to the front lines, as an International Institute for Strategic Studies report estimates that only 40% of all injured troops will ever be fit enough to fight again. Thinking more long-term, should the war keep on going for years and years to come, Russia will be reliant on people who are currently teenagers turning 18 and being legally allowed to enter the military. Last year, 800,000 Russian boys celebrated their 18th birthday, but it's likely only a small fraction would have any desire to put their young lives on the line in Ukraine. And the more young people grow up in the shadow of war, the less likely they will be to play a part in it. In short, Russia may just be able to generate enough manpower supply to meet demand for the time being, but that delicate balance will inevitably shift over time, and there will no longer be enough recruits to cover the losses. Of course, soldiers aren't the only resource that the Russian war machine has lost in massive amounts since the war started. As The Economist notes, equipment is another huge issue. Open-source intelligence data collected by the Dutch group Oryx shows that Russia has lost over 12,500 tanks and armored fighting vehicles, plus 2,674 artillery and missile systems, 166 aircraft, including fighter jets and bombers, and 164 helicopters too. What's more, all of these numbers are lower bound, and the real figures may be much, much higher, with some Ukrainian sources suggesting that Russia has actually lost close to 10,000 tanks and well over 20,000 armored vehicles. While much of Russia's lost equipment can be replaced, it all costs money, time, and resources, and Russia is rapidly running out of all three of those things. What's more, in more ways than one, the war is slowly but surely shifting in Ukraine's favor. The Economist report notes, for example, that after a brief pause in American assistance from late 2023 through to early 2024, Ukraine is now enjoying record levels of support from its allies around the world. The US appears more committed than ever before to aiding Ukraine, even announcing new intelligence-sharing partnerships and floating the possibility of long-range Tomahawk missile deliveries, while other nations across Europe are all playing their part to give Ukraine the funds and tools it needs to gain a tactical advantage. There's also the fact that numerous regions of Russia have recently descended into chaos as a result of the country's fast-spreading fuel crisis, a direct result of Ukraine's sustained, strategic strikes on critical oil infrastructure locations like pipelines and refineries. The crisis has led to Russia losing close to 40% of its oil refining capacity, with exports set to decline and hundreds of fuel stations facing unprecedented shortages. This, combined with all the other aforementioned losses and reliance on wasteful, unsustainable strategies, will only weaken Russia's economy and add to the ever-rising pile of problems building up on Putin's desk. Thus, as The Economist concludes, it may turn out the Russian economy will crumble far, far sooner than Ukraine's defensive lines do.
Propaganda is the most valuable tool that Russian President Vladimir Putin uses to keep his country under control. Beyond the army that he sent to Ukraine, the Kremlin employs a much different army of mouthpieces and writers who fill Russia's state-owned television shows, radio broadcasts, and newspapers with claims of Russian superiority. Typically absent are reports on what Ukraine has achieved. That's all part of the Putin plan. But what happens to that plan when the Kremlin narrative doesn't align with what the people it hires to talk it up are saying? Putin is about to find out, as he's been betrayed by his own propagandist who admits that Ukraine will never fall. That propagandist is Vladimir Solovyov, who's long been one of Putin's most vocal allies. Most every night, Solovyov takes to Russian state television to go on rants about how Ukraine is on the verge of collapse and that it will only be a matter of time before Russia achieves a magnificent victory. At least, that's what Solovyov does. However, October 13 was a very different day for the Kremlin's propaganda machine and one of Putin's favorite mouthpieces. This time, Solovyov didn't rant about the brilliance of Russia or the superiority of Putin's tactics. He was quieter, more somber than usual, and, as Euromaidan press reports, Solovyov was visibly shaken as he delivered words that Putin would never expected to hear out of one of his favorite puppets. "We underestimated what's happening. We thought NATO just sent finished products, but now the military-industrial complex is outside Ukraine," Solovyov said on his show. "Our strikes aren't decisive. Foreigners are actively joining Ukraine's ranks. There should be no illusions." That small quote is precisely what it sounds like. One of Putin's best propagandists is admitting that Ukraine is doing far better than he's claimed it's doing. And worse yet for Putin, the Russian military seems to have no answer. There are a couple of interesting things to note here. First, though he admits that Russia has made major miscalculations in the Ukraine war, Solovyov at least still attempts to pander to the Kremlin narrative. His claims that NATO is solely responsible for Ukraine having defended itself for so long aren't accurate. Yet the help Ukraine receives from its allies is vital, and it's played a huge part in the Ukraine war. But Solovyov is admitting, purposefully or otherwise, the fact that Ukraine has gotten stronger as a military nation, even without help from its NATO allies. That point will be explored later in the video. The second interesting thing here is that this isn't the first time that Solovyov has been critical of Russia's military. As far back as February 2023, a year into the war that Putin thought would be done and dusted in about a week, Solovyov ranted about the state of the Russian military. "Are we going to fight? If we are, using what or whom?" Solovyov declared on his TV program. "If we're waging the campaign seriously and we understand that the special military operation finished a long time ago and that we're now fighting NATO, then maybe we now need to implement something." He went on to claim that Russia was pushing 100 meters forward and 100 meters back, before stating that the 300,000 conscripted soldiers of the time were wearing down and needed to be rotated. So Solovyov is no stranger to taking little nibbles at the hand that feeds him. However, October 13 was different. Back in 2023, one could almost see his rant as a sort of call to action for Russia. Solovyov wasn't claiming that Russia was going to lose. He was just pointing out a problem and calling for a solution. Russia could and should win, even if Ukraine had allies who will deliver everything to them. Solovyov even coloured this 2023 rant with claims that Russia needs to go after the Western countries supplying Ukraine with weapons, even as he said that Russia's military was exhausted. It's easy to imagine these words coming out of Putin's mouth. Yet another criticism of NATO, and with 100 meters forward and 100 meters back comment, almost an admonishment of Russia's military for not being as capable as their authoritarian leader expected them to be. The October 13 comments, on the other hand, were delivered with an almost resigned tone. Gone were the hellfire and brimstone that often accompany Solovyov's rants, replaced by a straightforward statement that Ukraine is much stronger than Russia expected, and that Russia has underestimated the true threat that it faces on the Ukraine battlefield. Are these the sorts of words that Putin would be happy to hear? It seems unlikely. Solovyov may have just gone off script to deliver a damning indictment of Putin's failures, Ukraine's strength, and the war that's lasted almost 4 years when it was supposed to be over in about a week. This alone would be bad enough for the Kremlin, seeing one of its top propagandists betray the narrative on a TV show that is on Russia's most popular federal channel, and has even received an award for being the country's best socio-political show, is bad enough. However, it gets worse for the Kremlin, as Solovyov is far from the only propagandist who is starting to speak out against the Ukraine war. There are others, and they're getting louder. In a September 2022 interview, another Kremlin mouthpiece, Tatiana Montian, said that Russia is severely lacking the manpower that it needs to win the Ukraine war, and that Russia would be forced into another wave of mobilization if the spring-autumn campaign fails to gain the ground that Putin expected. In the first half of September, the pace of the offensive slowed significantly. They may have committed their last reserves, Montian said. The second half of September ended up being no better than the first, leading to the Russian advance slowing by nearly half of its previous pace by the end of the month. CNN reports that Russia occupied 44% less Ukrainian territory in September than it did in August, with August also being the end of Russia's much vaunted and ultimately failed summer offensive. Another Russian propagandist, Pavel Gubarev, has delivered an even fiercer indictment of Russia's situation in Ukraine. Once Putin's proxy leader in the Donetsk region, Gubarev said that Russia was suffering from incomparably heavy losses, before adding, "In reality, the current situation is already tantamount to defeat for us. Russia does not have the capability to complete the special military operation with the achievement of set goals and victory under the colonial system of the current government." As it stands, it would take Russia 108 years to fully occupy Ukraine, per Pravda reporting on statistics published by The Economist. Putin doesn't have that much time. Russia doesn't have enough people. And Putin's propagandists are starting to wake up to that fact. The Kremlin's propaganda machine is starting to break down, as explored in another video. Check that video out to learn more about what's happening with the voices Putin relies on to keep Russia's people under control. For now, back to Solyov's comments. The Kremlin propagandist towed the narrative line by laying all of the blame for Ukraine's stellar defense against Russia at NATO's feet. However, NATO weapons alone aren't the reason why Russia has spent nearly 4 years fighting Ukraine, only for no signs of the outright collapse Solyov and his ilk have been predicting for years. There's something much deeper going on that Solyov likely knows but is too afraid to say on state-owned Russian television. It's not just NATO, it's Ukraine. Specifically, Ukraine has somehow been growing stronger as a military nation throughout the Ukraine war, to the point where it's harder for Russia to win now than it might have been 2 or 3 years ago. And the first sign of this growing strength is the immense militarization of Ukraine. According to the George W. Bush Institute, Ukraine's standing army was only about 130,000 members strong when Putin first annexed Crimea. Even worse than that, the Institute claims only 6,000 of those soldiers were combat ready at the time of Russia's initial acts of aggression. Undersupply was also a problem, which is why Ukraine had to practically beg the US for things like blankets and military rations. The Institute adds that Ukraine's former chief of the general staff, Viktor Muzenko, claimed that about 75% of Ukraine's military equipment was over 2 decades old and likely obsolete in 2014. Only 12 of Ukraine's 800 tanks were usable, and just about 15% of Ukraine's combat aircraft were ready to fly. Between 2014 and 2022, Ukraine strengthened dramatically, and Russia didn't seem to notice. Putin's arrogant belief that his forces would steamroll through Ukraine seems to have been based on the state of Ukraine's military during the initial 2014 acts of aggression. When Ukraine pushed back against Russia's initial invasion, it did so with territorial fighters and a sense of purpose that didn't exist back in 2014. Ukraine was stronger in 2022 than it was when Russia annexed Crimea, and now Ukraine is more militarized than ever before. The Atlantic Council reports that Ukraine has about 1 million active service members who are defending it against Russia. That makes Ukraine's military 4 times larger than the next European military outside of Russia. And that sheer size is now combined with combat hardening and, yes, the modern weapons that Ukraine's allies have provided. Ukraine's growing military strength is often an underrated factor, the Council said in March. Solyov seems to have realized this with his statements about how Russia underestimated Ukraine. However, Ukraine's strength and massive militarization aren't limited to the size of its army or the contributions made by the West. Ukraine is stronger across the board as a military nation that's drawing closer to self-sufficiency than it would ever have become were it not for Putin. On the weapons production front, Ukraine is certainly much stronger than it has been at any point during its history as an independent country. As Euromaidan press reports, the period between January and July of 2025 saw Ukraine's Ministry of Defense increase its domestic weapons procurement by around $4.2 billion compared to the same period in 2024. Now, the country is projecting that it will spend about $35 billion on domestic missile and drone production alone in 2026. Keep Ukraine's drones in mind. They'll be revisited later in the video. The growth of Ukraine's domestic defense industry during the war with Russia has been staggering. Even as Russia bombards Ukraine weekly with aerial strikes, in addition to everything that Russia is doing on the ground, the growth has been explosive. At the beginning of the invasion, Ukraine made around 10% of its own weapons. 2 years later, the number was at 35%, and it had reached 40% by the middle of 2025, according to Vladimir Zelensky. Ukraine believes that the only way is further up in this aspect of its militarization. Back in July, Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky had bigger plans for the future. We're transforming the management of the defense sector and weapons production so that within 6 months, the share of Ukrainian-made weapons available to our warriors will noticeably increase, Ukraine's president proclaimed in a speech to the country's parliament. Currently, about 40% of the weapons in the hands of our warriors are made in Ukraine. In 6 months, it should be no less than 50%. So, it looks like Ukraine is not only ahead of schedule, but has surpassed even this ambitious goal. By September, The Guardian was reporting that around 60% of the weapons that Ukraine soldiers use are now built in Ukraine. Zelensky has provided that figure, adding that many of the weapons Ukraine is producing are more advanced than anything the country has built before. And that may be the point that Solyov is either missing or purposefully omitting. As important as Ukraine's Western allies have been when it comes to direct weapons procurement, Ukraine itself hasn't been idle on the defense manufacturing front. It's been learning, adapting, and most importantly, investing in its own defense industry. Whether the advanced weapons Ukraine is building are inspired by the Western arms it's received is immaterial at this point. The fact is that Ukraine's weapons manufacturing base is incredibly strong, and it's only getting stronger. That's something Russia never expected. And along with the massive growth of Ukraine's standing army, it's another factor that plays into Solyov's claim that there should be no illusions about Ukraine's capabilities. He's warning the Russian people that Ukraine is far stronger than the Kremlin's propaganda has shown them, and the growth of the country's defense sector is only making it stronger. Ukraine isn't self-sufficient yet, but it's getting closer. There is one thing that Solyov is bang on the money with: Ukraine's expanding international facilities. Though Ukraine is trying to centralize as much of its weapons production as possible, it also realizes that its international partners are vital to its continued success. After all, if Russia is able to locate and bomb Ukraine's weapons manufacturing facilities, all of the country's hard work goes out the window. Euromaidan Press notes that Ukraine currently builds 80% of its own drones, with the rest coming from joint projects with partners such as Denmark and Poland. On the missile front, these joint projects account for roughly 1/5 of Ukraine's missile building. Poland is also part of a Europe-wide partnership named the Czech Initiative, which has coordinated the delivery of millions of artillery shells to Ukraine through a broad coalition of donor nations. Ukraine has been very clever in the sense that it's built an entire network of manufacturing that is difficult for Russia to break. By incorporating its international partners into that network, Ukraine also protects itself. Another example comes from the production of the Artemis drone. Though the drone itself appears to be based on a Ukrainian design, the software and computerized systems that drive the drone are made by a US-based company named Auterion. Watch our video to discover more about the insane drone that Ukraine and its American partner have produced. Again, Ukraine is spreading its wings by bringing other nations into its weapons manufacturing fold. And this is weapons manufacturing, not weapons procurement or weapons donations. Solyov is accurate when he says that NATO-aligned nations are helping with all of this, but he discounts the role that Ukraine itself is playing. These sorts of manufacturing initiatives are full-on partnerships between Ukraine and its allies, and they benefit all involved. Add to that more procurement-focused initiatives, such as the US-led Pearl initiative, through which Ukraine can purchase the weapons it needs from the US with military aid received from its European allies. And that results in the sort of collaboration that Solyov decries. Only, it's a collaboration on a far deeper level than even the beleaguered propagandist realizes. This is quid pro quo. Ukraine's allies make it stronger, and Ukraine makes its allies stronger. For Russia, the result is a larger and better equipped Ukrainian army than Putin anticipated. That army uses weapons made in Ukraine that would never have been built were it not for the invasion. And the partnerships Ukraine has now are stronger than they would have been otherwise. Perhaps this is Solyov's point, though he doesn't outright say it. Putin overplayed his hand for too long, and now he's created a monster that Russia can't kill. As if things couldn't get any worse for Russia, it's not just that Ukraine is bigger and better than it was when Russia invaded. It's also smart. Much smarter than Putin believed, as Ukraine has demonstrated many times that it's able to adapt its tactics and focus its resources on the types of weapons that cause Russia the most problems. Right now, two types of weapons are turning Ukraine from an already powerful force into one that's capable of doing even more damage to Russia than seen already: long-range precision weapons and drones. On the long-range front, it's no secret that Ukraine has been targeting as many military and military-adjacent facilities inside Russia as it can. Oil refineries have been its main target in 2025, and a slew of strikes throughout August, September and October have seen Ukraine cripple nearly 40% of Russia's oil refining. The strikes have led to fuel shortages throughout Russia, which places pressure on Putin and forces Russia to rely on importing a product that it would have otherwise made itself. Ukraine knows exactly what it's doing with these strikes. It's chipping away at the Russian war machine, with each strike weakening Putin's forces on the ground in Ukraine. To support this death by 1,000 cuts strategy, Ukraine is building more precise long-range weapons in greater quantities than ever before. The Neptune and Flamingo weapons, in particular, are seeing Ukraine build hybrid cruise missiles that are incredibly accurate and pack a far greater punch than the drones the country has been using in its long-range strikes up to this point. Flamingo, which is a 1,860-mile range that puts even Moscow at risk, has entered mass production and will soon be wreaking havoc on targets all over Russia. Again, the point always stands. None of this would have happened if Putin hadn't invaded Ukraine. And then there are Ukraine's drones. Earlier examples have shown how effective these drones have been when it comes to Ukraine's long-range strikes. But they've been a revolution on the battlefield. Ukraine has built a literal drone army that's capable of taking out almost any equipment that Russia has. Tanks have proven especially vulnerable to a cheap drone's ability to get in close and launch kamikaze attacks. However, Ukraine has been using drones to destroy other armor, air defense radars, and troop deployments too. What Putin believed would be a relatively short war of attrition that would see Russia's superior manpower and equipment numbers win out in the end has transformed into drone-focused combat. Ukraine now has the capacity to build between 8 and 10 million drones per year, assuming it's able to get its hands on the funding that will allow its drone manufacturers to reach their potential, the Jamestown Foundation reports. As for drone effectiveness, Ukraine's unmanned vehicles are now responsible for up to 80% of all of Russia's casualties in the Ukraine war. It may soon be more, especially now that Ukraine is working with its Western partners to create smarter drones, such as the Artemis mentioned earlier. This is the reality of the Ukraine war that propagandists like Solyov are only now starting to report. Yes, Solyov's betrayal of the Kremlin narrative still lays all of the blame at NATO, but he knows, as do Russia's other propagandists, that Russia itself has turned Ukraine into a far more militarized nation. Ukraine may never fall, and if it does, that fall will take a huge toll on Russia to the point where a country that was once one of the world's leading military superpowers will be left as a lame duck just waiting for a more powerful nation to put it out of its misery. Another Ukrainian drone strike targets Crimea. Confident in its ability to defend the annexed territory, Russia unleashes its air defenses, sending everything from missiles flying to fighter jets so it can intercept the incoming drones. But something goes wrong. Rather than taking out a drone, Russia hits the very last thing that it would ever wanted to hit: its own fighter jet. Russia tried to defend Crimea, only to blow up their own Su-30 jet right out of the sky. Russian military incompetence is laid bare as one of the country's most important aircraft is reduced to a flaming wreck by its own munitions. At least that's according to an October 17 report from the Kyiv Independent, which says that Russia tried and failed to prevent a Ukrainian drone strike on the Crimean Peninsula. In the panic of what was clearly a rushed defense, the outlet reports, Russia sent one of its Su-30 SM fighter jets into the skies, only to accidentally shoot that very jet down itself in all of the chaos. The claim comes from Dmytro Pletenchuk, who is the spokesperson for the Ukrainian Navy. The enemy likely shot down its own multi-role fighter while repelling a Ukrainian drone attack using air defense systems, Pletenchuk told the Kyiv Independent. And this doesn't appear to be a baseless speculation. Pletenchuk's claim is based on an intercepted radio transmission that appears to demonstrate exactly what happened over Crimea. The official Ukrainian Navy Telegram channel offers more information, with a post stating, Ukrainian Navy intelligence received radio intercepts about the ignition of 2 engines and the ejection of the crew of the Russian invaders' Su-30 SM aircraft, which was performing tasks in the northwestern part of the temporarily occupied Autonomous Republic of Crimea. There would be no reason for an ejection to be performed, especially during an active Ukrainian drone strike, unless the Su-30 SM was on its way down. Only Ukraine knows that it didn't hit the jet with any of its drones or missiles. If it had, the country's navy would have almost certainly made it public. So there can only be two conclusions. Either the Su-30SM suffered some sort of technical malfunction that forced its crew to eject, leaving the plane to crash. Or, as Ukraine's navy suggests, Russia just hit one of its own jets. It's likely that the enemy, while repelling the UAV attack with the use of air defense systems, shot down its own multi-role fighter, the Ukrainian Navy Telegram post states. So Ukraine's navy and its navy spokesperson are saying the same thing. This is a humiliating event for Russia. But at least Russia managed to fend off Ukraine's drone assault, even if it lost one of its Su-30SMs to friendly fire, right? Not according to Pletenchuk, who Euromaidan Press reports as saying, "The Russians will have less fuel because another oil depot caught fire today. We hope our operations in Crimea continue at this pace." If the Russians have less fuel and an oil depot in Crimea is on fire, that tells us that Ukraine scored direct hits with its drones. It seems that Russia was so busy firing at its own aircraft that it failed to actually hit the incoming munitions that presented a threat. Confirmation of Ukraine's success comes from two sources, the first of which is the Crimean Wind Telegram channel, often the source of breaking news, along with much needed evidence of Ukraine's successful strikes in Crimea. The channel shared an image and a map that appeared to confirm that Ukraine's drones did their job of hitting the Gvardiskoye airfield and a nearby oil refinery. The map shows the relative positions of the damaged oil depot and the airfield, Crimean Wind says of one of the images that it shares. The photo shows two columns of smoke. The one on the right is from the burning oil depot. The channel says of a picture that shows smoke rising from two sources. As for the second source, Ukraine's Special Operations Forces are already telling the world about their successful strike. On the night of October 17, units of the Special Operations Forces used strike drones to hit a number of enemy targets in the temporarily occupied territory of the Autonomous Republic of Crimea, the Special Operations Forces reported on its own Telegram channel. The result of the successful actions of the Special Operations Forces of Ukraine is the destruction of an oil depot in the village of Gvardiskoye and an FDKU of the Gvardiskoye plant in the village of Karyana, Saksky district. Now, that depot appears to be in flames. What's here is a 2-for-1 dose of humiliation for Vladimir Putin and the forces that Russia's leader has dedicated to defending Crimea. Not only has Russia somehow managed to shoot down one of its jets out of the sky while defending annexed Crimea against Ukraine's drones, but it's also failed to stop all of those drones from hitting their targets. As has become typical for the Russian Defense Ministry at this point, there's no official word from Russia on the fate of its stricken Su-30SM. Instead, the country prefers to focus on what it believes it's managed to achieve when defending itself against Ukraine's attack. As the Moscow Times notes in its report on Russia shooting down one of its own fighter jets, the Russian Defense Ministry has made no mention of anything other than the projectiles that its air defenses managed to take out. Overnight into October 17, the ministry claims, Russia's air defenses managed to destroy 61 Ukrainian drones, including 38 that were flying over the Black Sea and Crimea. It can be assumed that Russia's own jet wasn't included in the 38. However, it wouldn't be surprising if Russia added the jet just to pump up the numbers. And ultimately, it doesn't matter. Russia can claim to have shot down as many drones as it likes, but that doesn't change the fact that Ukraine hit its target and somehow indirectly managed to take out a Su-30SM by way of Russia's incompetence. So, what has Russia just lost over Crimea? The Su-30 is widely considered to be among the best fighter jets that Russia has in its arsenal, at least by Russia itself. In August 2021, just a few months before Vladimir Putin launched the Ukraine invasion, Military Watch magazine said that the first Su-30 took flight in December 1989, just a couple of years before the collapse of the Soviet Union. That makes it a Cold War era jet, a statement bolstered by the fact that the Su-30 began development in 1986 and was originally going to be built as another entry into Russia's Su-27 program. As Military Watch magazine notes, the Su-30 is today fielded in larger numbers worldwide than any other Su-27 derivative and remains in production today for both the Russian military and for export, with capabilities having improved markedly since the 1990s. The outlet adds that before the Ukraine war began, Russia's Air Force had about 135 of these jets, with the Su-30 and its variants being favoured due to their relatively low maintenance requirements and the fact that they retain many of the capabilities of the Su-27 on which it was based. Of these 135 Su-30s in the Russian Air Force, around 95 of them are the Su-30 SM variant that Russia just managed to shoot down. Another 22 of these jets are deployed by the Russian Navy, which should make clear the esteem in which Russia holds this particular jet. And there's a good reason why Russia thinks so highly of the jet it just shot down. Even with the advent of the Su-35, the Su-30 SM is still one of the best jets that Russia can field. A multi-role fighter jet crewed by 2 people, the Su-30 SM flies at a maximum speed of about Mach 1.75, or about 1,350 miles per hour at high altitude in perfect conditions. The jet is equipped with a range of sensors, including an OLS-30 IRST with laser ranging used to guide its weapons to its targets, and an L-175V Kibani 10V radar warning receiver that serves a more defensive purpose. As for the Su-30 SM's loadout, the jet lives up to its reputation as a multi-role fighter. It can fire several guided munitions, including multiple versions of Russia's AA-10, the AA-11, AS-14, AS-17, and AS-18. Cab and Fab dump bombs can also be loaded into the jet, which shows that Russia can also use its Su-30 SMs to launch the infamous glide bombs it's been using to pound Ukraine cities. These glide bombs are essentially Russian Fab and Cab bombs equipped with special wing kits and basic satellite navigation systems, which increase the dumb bomb's range and allow Russia to drop those bombs without being directly over a target. The idea is to ensure that the jet used to launch a glide bomb is at little risk of being shot down as possible. That doesn't really mean much when Russia is doing the hard work of shooting down Su-30 SMs for Ukraine. Only a handful of the guided munitions and bombs the Su-30 SM can launch have been touched upon so far, as there are many more. But the Su-30 SM has several other features that set it apart from Russia's older Su-30 models. These include a NO-11M BARS radar, Military Watch magazine reports. That radar has a 248-mile maximum detection range, along with a wide-angle heads-up display, and ironically, a new identification system that allows the Su-30 SM's pilot to identify friend from foe. Perhaps Russia's air defense operators could have done with this radar on the night of October 17. Euromaidan press adds to the reasons why a Su-30 SM is likely the last jet that Russia would have wanted to lose, especially to its own fire. The outlet notes that Russia uses these jets extensively to fire Kh-31P and Kh-58 anti-radiation missiles that are specifically designed to weaken a country's air defenses. The idea here is that the anti-radiation missiles target anything that emits a radio frequency, such as a radar system. The missiles then take out that system, ideally leaving the path clear for other munitions to cause serious damage elsewhere. Again, the Su-30 SM's versatility is clear here. With one of these jets downed over Crimea, any future aerial assaults Russia hope to launch from the peninsula may be less effective due to its not having the jet that fires anti-radiation missiles. Oh, and the cost? Euromaidan press claims that a single Su-30 SM sets Russia back $50 million. However, Military Watch magazine tempers that claim somewhat, as it reports that the Su-30 SM likely cost the Russian Defense Ministry around $12 million, which suggests the $50 million figure is what Russia sells the jet for. Either way, that's millions of dollars Russia wouldn't have wanted to see go up in smoke at the best of times, never mind as a result of a mess up in its air defenses that will also have seen it spend money on the munitions it used to shoot its own jet down. Now, beyond the money, the loss of a Su-30 SM will sting Russia because it's struggling to scale fighter jet production due to components and labor shortages. That's according to Newsweek, which reported on July 3rd that a shortage of skilled workers and required components has seriously hampered Russia's ability to build new warplanes. Normally, this would be a case of how a combination of Ukraine's flying sanctions and the West's traditional sanctions is paying off. But this time, Russia unwittingly unleashed a flying sanction of its own to destroy a much-needed multi-role fighter jet that it will likely be unable to replace. That doesn't mean Russia can't send another Su-30 SM to Crimea. It means that Russia can't replenish the stockpiles of these jets as more are destroyed over time. As humiliating as all of this is for Russia and Putin, this must at least be an isolated incident. Surely Russia hasn't made a habit of destroying its own people and equipment with friendly fire incidents that could have been avoided. That isn't the case at all. As the Ukraine war heads closer to the conclusion of its 4th year, it's become clear that Russia has something of a penchant for hitting itself rather than its enemy. This pattern appears across all areas of the war, including at the basic infantry level. And sometimes friendly fire happens because Russian soldiers simply can't stand the conditions that their military places them in. At least, that's what appears to have happened to one Russian conscript who was based in Moscow's Naro-Fominsk military base. On October 17, Russia's state media reported that the conscript shot and killed one of Russia's contract soldiers before he took his own life. The Kyiv Independent reports that the Moscow military district claims that the soldier violated firearm handling rules, which led to the deaths. That's one way to say a Russian soldier fatally shot another Russian soldier before turning his gun on himself. While this particular case of friendly fire appears to have occurred because a Russian soldier cracked under the pressure of their job, there are many others that bear a much closer similarity to what happened to the Su-30 SM over Crimea on October 17. Bombs, for example, seem to be one of Russia's favorite weapons for use against itself. In January 2024, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty reported that Russia had confirmed that its military accidentally bombed one of its own villages in southern Voronezh during a massive airstrike that was supposed to target Ukraine. Russia managed to do plenty of damage by hitting itself this time, damaging 6 buildings in the village of Petropavlovka, though at least managing not to kill any of its own civilians. At least, that's what Russia's report claims. A little over a year later, there was another report of Russia bombing itself. This time, the Kyiv Independent says Russia dropped one of its supposed smart bombs on one of its villages in the Belgorod region. These smart bombs use the same fab warheads that were mentioned earlier and that the Su-30 SM can launch, only they're equipped with a navigation module that should ensure that they reach their targets. The Belgorod bomb didn't. It was another example of Russia hitting Russia, though the bomb didn't explode upon impact. In its report, the Kyiv Independent also reveals that Russia managed to hit itself with 165 of its own fab bombs in 2024 alone, and had also struck itself with 13 of these bombs by January 26 of 2025. That amounts to a strike every 2 days, which suggests that there's a problem with the Russian arsenal. That problem, a separate report in the Washington Post suggests, could be that Russia's misguided bombs are suffering from technical malfunctions that cause them to touch down long before they travel past Russia's border with Ukraine. The outlet quotes Ruslan Leviev, who's a military expert with the Conflict Intelligence Group, who said in a 2024 Frontline update published to YouTube, "A certain percentage of Russian bombs is defective. We think these accidental releases are caused by the unreliability of these kits, something that doesn't seem to bother the Air Force." By the way, as mentioned a moment ago, Russia had hit itself with 13 of its own bombs by January 26. Fast forward to the end of July, and that number was up to 100, many of which have struck civilian areas, and some of which have landed near schools. A previous video covered this insane statistic, so check it out to learn more about what's going wrong with Russia's bombs. With all of this, perhaps it isn't surprising that Russia shot down one of its own Su-30 SMs. It certainly has a track record of hitting itself. But for the final bit of salt rubbed into the wound, it's not just crazed infantrymen or misguided bombs that are leading to Russia's many friendly fire incidents. Sometimes, Russia just does what it appears to have done on October 17 and destroys one of its own aircraft. There are several examples. In April 2024, the New Voice of Ukraine said that Russia had lost at least 13 of its aircraft to friendly fire incidents in just over 2 years of war with Ukraine. It discusses the findings of a Russian outlet named The Insider, which says it's based its findings on claims in Russian sources, including several state-run outlets. The latter is about as definitive as one can get in terms of confirmation that these incidents actually happened. Russia's losses tailed up to 4 of its Su-35s, a trio of its Su-34s, a pair of A-50U early warning and control aircraft, and 1 each of the Su-27 fighter jet, Mi-8 transport chopper, and an Mi-24 helicopter. Other reports cite different totals, but the overall scale of losses remained consistent. Bear in mind that these are the 13 that Russian outlets reported on. There may be many more. By December 2024, at least 1 extra aircraft had been added to the list. This time, it was a Ka-52 chopper, Defense Blog reported at the time. That information was revealed by the pro-war Russian Telegram channel Fighter Bomber, which said, "Preliminarily our air defense system," when reporting on the loss of the Ka-52. As for 2025, the Su-30 SM in Crimea isn't even the first of its own fighter jets that Russia has taken out. In June, the Kyiv Post reported that Russia had accidentally destroyed one of its Su-25s near the settlements of Solidar. Again, fighter bomber reported on the incident. Astonishingly, the same Telegram channel also published a video of what appears to have happened. The footage shows two Su-25s flying side by side until, inexplicably, one of the jets fires a missile at the other. The targeted jet erupts into flames before crashing. The pilot, fighter bomber said, managed to escape the incident with little more than a broken arm. Hilariously, fighter bomber concluded their post by claiming that the Ukrainians will answer for this. How? Russia shot down its own jet. There's no blaming Ukraine for that. At least with the recent downing of the Su-30 SM, Russia can at least say it had been forced into action by a Ukrainian drone strike. One Russian Su-25 firing on another is more of an indicator of Russia's poor pilot training than anything else. It's starting to look like Russia is losing its grip on its own military. Friendly fire incidents happen, but to this scale and with such valuable hardware, for any other country, October 17 would have been an isolated incident that outlets all over the world would report far and wide. Based on everything just covered, shooting down one of its own Su-30 SMs is just another day at the office for a Russian military that seems to keep on finding new lows to which it can plunge. As for Crimea, Putin's hold on that peninsula seems to be slipping by the day, just like his military's ability to aim its own air defenses. Beyond the refinery Ukraine hit on October 17, another giant fireball recently erupted over Crimea as Ukraine torched an oil depot. It's not the first time that Ukraine has hit this depot, as you'll discover if you check out our video. And if you enjoyed this video, be sure to subscribe to the Military Show for more coverage of Russia's latest blunders.